Yo, welcome everyone. Zikorik here. I hope you're having a good time in Eternum. I've been absolutely loving it since I came back a couple weeks ago, and it's just making me more and more excited, not just about the potential of the game itself, but the potential within the game to try new builds and really dive deep and play the game in exactly the play style you're wanting to or feeling at that time. And I really think one of the beautiful things about this game is the depth of customization and personalization you can achieve with how you're playing, with your style, with your build path. And so what I'm trying to do through making some of these build guide videos is open up new ways for people to play the game in a style that they enjoy more than maybe anything they've tried before. And hopefully that leads to them trying new stuff themselves. I think one of the coolest things about this game is how kind of quickly you can theory craft and test stuff with how you can swap gear and builds and weapons kind of just on a moment's notice. And I gotta say, I just absolutely love hearing about that stuff in the comments of these videos I do, where people have either tried this build or some variation of this build, or they're just offering a suggestion of some other build they tried or have been thinking about that could be really cool. So if you've tried anything or if you got any ideas, I have a very long list at this point of builds that I'm sort of looking at and trying to prioritize. So really always love hearing and reading that stuff in the comments. So just want to let you guys know that I really appreciate your feedback. And also want to give a big shout out to all the love and support I got on this last build guide I did on the Bow Greatsword. So as promised, I'm really going to be trying to deliver a couple more niche, high quality build guides over the next couple weeks. Not just for leveling and fresh start, but also for PvE at 60. And so the format I think I'm going to start trying to follow that I think will sort of be best organically for me creating them and best for the viewers watching them is going to be taking a look at a build holistically on the PvE side of things. So from leveling up all the way to the PvE at level 60, probably not getting too deep into sort of the min-maxing of like mutated dungeons and stuff like that, but more focused on combat strategy, build path, and sort of the intent behind the build. And then from there, I'm really going to try to take those builds and morph them, form them into a version that's viable for PvP. And that's going to come out sometime later as another build guide for that build, but specifically for PvP. And so my vision is to kind of have these two different videos that you can reference on each kind of build, where you have sort of the fundamentals of combat and leveling and PvE, and kind of get a feel for how the weapons work together, which is sort of how I start with these builds, and then take that and move it to a place where it's actually viable in PvP, in OPR, in Arena, in Wars. But the reality is that second part takes much more time to figure out and to establish. And so rather than taking, a month to make a video and packing it all in one, I'm going to try to get more and more sort of these niche build guides out on the PvE side of things, and then really try to follow those up sometime later with a PvP guide of that build where it's sort of morphed to be maximally viable for PvP. And after I've had some time kind of practicing it and really feeling it out, and giving it a fair assessment in the PvP world, essentially. Alrighty, so in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Firehammer build. So this is an int-based build wielding the Fire Staff and an Elemental Warhammer. I think the coolest thing about this build is the amount of combos and synergies the weapons actually have together, despite being sort of disparate weapons, one only scaling with strength and one only scaling with int. The amount of utility and control that the hammer has to actually set up the DPS of the Fire Staff feels amazing. And with a lot of weapons, there's sort of certain combos that work, but with these weapons, it really feels like any of the Fire Staff abilities pair really well, actually, with any of the Warhammer abilities. So rather than having like a couple combos you can do, you can more sort of like flow through combat where you're using whatever combo feels situationally right, or just kind of, going with the flow for whatever situation you're in. I think if you really enjoy playing like sort of battle mage archetypes in games where you have magic, but you also have a melee weapon to kind of go into battle with, and you're pretty beefy, you can take trades, but also dish out good damage, I think you'll really end up enjoying this build. The original idea for this one actually came from my very first build guide that I did for New World like a year ago, which was Ice Hammer, using the Ice Gauntlet and the hammer. And so this is kind of the next iteration of that, using the Fire Staff. Personally, I absolutely love trying builds for weapons that don't belong together. So like an int weapon in the fire staff and a strength weapon in the warhammer. Some of the things you can do with the elemental gems to bring that hammer over to being like a halfway int weapon really opens up some really fun and exciting synergy and combos between int weapons and strength or dex weapons that don't necessarily belong together, and thus you don't normally see people playing them together. This one in particular actually very much surprised me with how well it scales at level 60, how powerful it actually is in Brimstone Sands, just mowing stuff over to the point where within the first day or two, I was soloing most of the different elites across the Sandlands easier than I could in any of my sort of comfort dex bow builds, which is a little bit of an anomaly because you would think that not being able to fully scale that hammer with strength, this build would be naturally weaker statistically than a lot of the other builds where you're running double strength weapons or double dex weapons. And statistically it is, but when you look at the setup and the CC and the control the hammer has to sort of empower and guarantee the fire staff abilities, you realize that even though you're sacrificing a bit of damage on your hammer, this build has the potential to absolutely dominate on the PvE side of things pretty much in any scenario you're in. A couple more things that make this build really cool that I want to mention up front here is that I think it's a pretty easy build to play. Like, I kind of naturally just fell into it really quickly. I didn't have to learn that much. It felt sort of naturally fluid, and because all the abilities kind of work with each other for both weapons, there's not really a way you can like mess up a combo. Like, kind of all the combos are good. There's just kind of some more optimal ones to like max out that damage and burning. But it's just a really feel good build to kind of drop into right away if you like magic and you like trading in melee. But at the same time, the power level seems kind of insane to where I think if you got really good at this build, it does have a really high skill cap where you could do some pretty insane stuff, like soloing, you know, some of the giant elite bosses in the game, and stuff like that. And on that note, you are really hard to kill in this build, like exceptionally hard to kill. I was so surprised by how kind of invincible I felt a lot of the time trading with these elites. And for most of the clips in this video, I wasn't running any lifesteal. All the healing you see is inherent in the weapon abilities. The only thing I have on top of that is regeneration perk on my earrings. And so I think if you did end up investing in a fire staff with lifestealing and you found a good ring with lifestealing on it, and then if you use these new casings to give that fire staff 3% more lifesteal with this leeching casing, and then you can actually use that leeching casing for armor now. So this is like, you know, level 60 expensive Brimstone Sand stuff, but if you were able to put a leeching case on every piece of your armor as well, you're going to get 8% extra leeching. So 3% from the weapon case and then 1% from each armor case, on top of the 5% you can get on your weapon and the 5% you can get on your ring. So you can actually get up to 18% base leeching with this build. And I think because you're kind of already so invincible, and if you stack that with regeneration on your earrings and add in all the self-healing you're getting from the fire staff and the warhammer abilities, you're really just regenning so much off your damage, and you're so beefy that not only are you really hard to kill, you're going to just be like regenning off of all the damage you do. And so I think that would kind of be the final form of this build for like 60 PvE, is sort of like a full fire hammer vamp build, where you're doing all this damage, you're super beefy, and then you're healing off all that damage. And I think that would open up some really cool potential, you know, not just to kind of make you invincible when you're just doing normal stuff or doing dungeons or whatever, but also give you the ability to, you know, solo or duo, you know, really high level elite mobs and even bosses if you get good at the build and get good, you know, at dodging and mitigating damage. And then very last thing that we're going to get into a little deeper when we talk about combat strategy is just the fact that the Warhammer really covers one of the main weaknesses of Magic, which is breaking guard. And so Magic really struggles like doing stamina damage, like punching through the block, especially like a lot of NPCs in, I mean, zones across Eternum, but especially in the Sandlands, there's a lot of mobs with shields. And so the Warhammer gives you an ability to instantly break that guard with one heavy attack and then go into your magic damage versus trying to like whittle through it with magic. which is huge in my opinion, and makes like churning through mobs and especially for leveling a lot faster and less frustrating, more efficient, which is huge in my opinion. All right, so for this one, rather than taking a look at the leveling stuff first, I really want to start with the combat strategy and some of the combos you can achieve with these two weapons together. And I've said it a couple times already, but I really love the combos that you can achieve with these two weapons. And that's another reason why I want to start with them. So like a lot of weapons, a lot of builds, you're kind of using one weapon and you cycle through the ability cooldowns of that weapon, and then you switch to your other weapon and use those abilities while you're waiting on the abilities of your other weapon to come off cooldown. So while you're using the two weapons together, you're kind of using them one at a time. You're using one, getting that DPS out, then switching to the other, using that one, then going back. With this build, and I think the reason a lot of these like melee hybrid int builds are so cool is the actual abilities pair very nicely with each other. So every Warhammer ability is actually very good to set up every Fire Staff ability that we're running. And so this leads to a lot more weapon swapping, a lot more variation in your combat, a lot more setup for different situations depending on what's going on. And for me, you know, really brings out that joy of combat, that feeling of just being a total badass because you're doing all this really cool shit together. And when you're doing it with fire, you know, especially with like a flamethrower and then a giant warhammer that's also on fire, it's just like that much more cool and satisfying. All right, so taking a look at the specific combos, I'm gonna basically lay out the three that I think are kind of the best. So the three Warhammer abilities that set up the three Fire Staff abilities the best. But just like we just talked about, I think every Warhammer ability could actually work with every Fire Staff ability. So I'm going to basically give you kind of the three optimal combos, but know that you can use any Fire Staff ability after any Warhammer ability. In general, the pattern is Warhammer to set up Fire Staff. And you can trade with just your Warhammer, and you're going to be getting pretty good damage out of that still, but it's going to be somewhere in like the 70% range of what you would be getting with the equivalent hammer attributes and strength. And so let's say you're at 300 int and you have an elemental gem in that hammer. I think that's about 70% the power of 300 strength Warhammer. Just baseline without a gem or anything in it, right? And that's because you're getting 50% scaling from the int, and then you still have the base damage of the weapon without any of that strength scaling on it. So that's the 20%, and then the 50% is scaled with your int. And so when you're swinging your hammer, you're always going to see much bigger fire numbers, or whatever elemental gem you choose, much bigger elemental numbers than the actual strike damage. Okay, so continuing with the idea of the Warhammer kind of setting up and guaranteeing the damage from the Fire Staff, kind of your mantra for your combos in this build is going to be putting stuff on their ass with the Warhammer and then lighting it on fire with the Fire Staff. And so very first combo that's kind of my go-to is using Wrecking Ball with the hammer to put stuff on the ground and then instantly swapping to your Fire Staff and starting the flamethrower and just torching them while they're fucking laying there. And so that's just like a really feel good combo to me, and it's up quite often. Like every time you have Wrecking Ball up, you can look to switch to your hammer, put one or multiple things on their ass, and then just instantly pull the staff back out and start lighting it on fire and start getting that burn going, start getting that constant DPS pump from the Fire Staff. And Flamethrower is one of those abilities that always like sounded really cool, but I never I tried it a little bit like way back, but it didn't used to feel that good. But now the fully upgraded Flamethrower, especially for PvE, is kind of insane. You get out really strong DPS. As soon as you stop doing that and go do something else, you have that burn rolling on them, a lot of times at 5 stacks, because it actually builds up very quickly. And having an ability that you can sort of like toggle on without a cooldown, you can sort of just toggle it on and off instantly with that ability button to replace or fill the gaps between your abilities and where you would normally be auto-attacking is actually like really cool mechanic to mess around with, where your flamethrower is always up. So not only do you always have the option, like if all your abilities are on cooldown, you always have the option to just torch something. Instead of auto-attacking, if that's, you know, the ideal situation. So for me, most of the times, if stuff is within flamethrower range, I'm fucking torching it. If it's further away, that's when you want to, be trading heavy attacks with the fire staff. And we'll talk about why heavy attacks are kind of a little higher value than light attacks in this build. But fundamentally, kind of having that no cooldown ability to fill the gaps between autos and give you this kind of constant damage that also sets stuff on fire is really fun to play around with. And when you have a big group of mobs clumped together, or you're in a dungeon where there's a bunch of mobs on your tank, the amount of cleave, like group cleave, you can actually get with the flamethrower is kind of nuts, because it'll just pass through that direct line that you're torching. And so you can just be getting a ton of constant damage out on a very large number of mobs while also setting them on fire. So as soon as you switch to do something else, like stun them or put them on their ass, they're going to be constantly burning that whole time from your flamethrower. And I think that's a really good segue into talking about one of the other fire staff abilities that you can use as part of a combo, but also is very good to sort of supplement these first two combos I'm going to talk about, and that's the fireball. What you can do is you can actually fireball right before you do this combo. And so if you fucking nail something with a fireball, the ground under them is going to be burning. So if you hit them with the fireball and then wrecking ball them with the hammer and put them on their ass in that fireball burn, and then switch to your fire staff and start the flamethrower, like the combo we just talked about, not only are they going to be starting to burn from your flamethrower, they're also going to be taking that continuous fireball damage because they're just on their ass in the burn. So second combo that works really well is Shockwave into Incinerate. And so Shockwave is your giant, super powerful, probably the best Warhammer ability. In my opinion, it's the giant AoE stun, and it has grit. And so it's this giant, uninterruptible AoE stun, which is part of the reason why it's so obnoxious in PvP, is unless you dodge it, there's not a ton you can do to avoid it. And this ability pairs beautifully with what I think is an amazing fire staff ability, but is actually very challenging to hit a lot of the time to guarantee the damage, and that is Incinerate. And Incinerate has this really cool upgrade where when you get to the final upgrade for it, it'll actually hit twice, and it has a 20% heal on the damage dealt from it. And each hit causes an additional stack of burning. So if you actually are able to hit both instances of your Incinerate, not only are you going to get a double burn stack, you're going to get 20% heal off both of those hits. And so the reason the kind of damage and healing on this ability is so strong is because it's a slow animation, and it's actually pretty challenging to hit without getting staggered or stunned or fucked up in some way. And so this combo with Shockwave gives you a guaranteed way to hit both of your Incinerate strikes on your target or on multiple targets. And so you got this giant AoE stun, and then you have this giant fire burst that you can do off of that stun that's going to hit twice and heal you and give another additional double burn stack on that target or multiple targets, right? And then you can do the same weaving with Fireball that we talked about in the first combo, where if you Fireball right before this stun, you're going to stun them in the ground that's burning. So they're going to be suffering from the burn ground from the Fireball while they're stunned, and then that's going to lead into the mega Incinerate damage. And actually, if you did the first combo right before all this, they're also going to be continuously burning from those flamethrower stacks. So if you Wrecking Ball something onto the ground, then torch it with the flamethrower, then as it's getting up, fireball it so that ground is on fire, then go into a Shockwave stun, that target is going to be sitting there stunned while they're burning from the flamethrower stacks and the ground from the fireball, and then that's going to lead into the guaranteed Incinerate that's going to do mega damage, heal you for 20% of the damage done off both hits, and add another double burn stack right as they're coming out of that stun. So super fun, super satisfying, like mega damage combo you can rip out on stuff without ever getting touched. And so just taking a look at these two combos, you kind of start to see the power between the hammer and the staff, where you're using the hammer to lock stuff up and then guarantee the fire damage off of it. So Wrecking Ball to put stuff on their ass, pulling out the flamethrower to light it on fire. Once it gets up from that, big stun with the Shockwave into a guaranteed Incinerate. So now they have the burns from the flamethrower and they have the Incinerate burns. And you can fireball before all this. So if you start the fight with a fireball, and then you go into putting them on their ass in the fireball, torching them, then stunning them in the fireball burn after that, and then incinerating them, you're going to get literally all of your possible burns on the target pretty much guaranteed. Because of the control of the hammer, if you're timing it right, that mob is never going to have time to dodge, to react, to do anything to stun you or stagger you out of this combo. And so that sort of leads to the last two abilities for each weapon, which is the Fireball, which we talked a little bit, and Path of Destiny with the Warhammer. And so after you do these first two combos, Path of Destiny, just like in general, is a really good way to get a big stagger slow, either on one mob or especially on like a big group of mobs, to give you a little more space and time to either continue torching them with the flamethrower or like set up the next combo. So Path of Destiny is kind of like your utility like reset that you want to use at the end of the combo. And because of the Warhammer Keystone we're getting Aftershock, every time you hit them with Path of Destiny, they're going to get that 20% slow for 4 seconds. And there's a really good perk that I actually wasn't running in this, but you can get a bigger kind of self-heal off the Path of Destiny as well with a Warhammer perk. And then if you Path of Destiny a bunch of stuff and it's slowed, it's so easy to hit your Fireball. And so Fireball and Path of Destiny you can kind of use together as the third combo, but they're also very good at kind of weaving into these first two combos wherever they feel good and right to keep spacing and to keep, consistent damage and to keep torching stuff. And so I think, when in doubt or when stuff is on cooldown, you really want to be just fucking torching stuff with the flamethrower and like trying to dodge incoming attacks as you're torching. And the cool thing with no cooldown flamethrower is like you can just dodge and instantly go back into lighting stuff on fire. And then if you're further away, you're going to want to be trading with fire staff heavies. And then as soon as stuff gets close to you, you're looking to utilize that Warhammer. And, the Warhammer can still be effective from a range with Path of Destiny. So there's really just a ton of options and a ton of setup. And you can see from some of these clips that, even if you don't follow that order, even if you use Wrecking Ball and then you incinerate while they're on their ass, or if you use Shockwave and then you torch them out of the stun, or you Fireball them out of the stun, like it's all really good and it all feels really good. These are just kind of like the go-tos that I think are sort of the best or the optimal setup to, kind of min-max your damage and your burst and your utility while staying alive and stuff like that. So last thing I want to touch on with the combat strategy before we kind of move on to the build progression is the fact that the Warhammer really covers one of the main weaknesses of Magic, and that is breaking through guard. And so magic damage in general really struggles doing stamina damage, which is basically the amount of damage you do to someone's stamina bar as they're blocking. So rocking double int weapons, especially for certain mobs in PvE, it can be very frustrating to try to get any damage out because you kind of got to whittle your way through that giant stamina bar before you can even hit them. But now that you have yourself a Warhammer, it is the best weapon in the game at breaking guard. So a charged heavy attack from the Warhammer will pretty much break any stamina bar in one hit for PvE. The only mob that I didn't break in one hit was these level 66 shielded ancient buttholes right by like the Eniad entrance, like the south side of that pyramid. But literally every other mob, you will break the full stamina bar in one big heavy, one fully charged heavy from the Warhammer. And so PvE in Brimstone Sands, there's a bunch of guys with shields, a bunch of guys walking, leveling up across the world. There's always guys with shields being annoying with their stamina bar. So this weapon combo gives you a way to just quickly swap to the Warhammer, get in one big heavy to break that stamina bar, and then swap back to the fire staff or go into some of these combos to be pumping damage while their guard is broken. And then as soon as the shield is back up, you can just switch right back to the hammer into one more big heavy, boom, shield's gone again. So it's a very efficient way to deal with blockers and with stamina damage with a magic weapon. All right, now diving into the fire staff progression. So after I ran this build for a couple days, there was actually two talents that I ended up switching that I think are going to be higher value than they were before. And so that was this trial by fire at the end of Pyromancer I actually took that out because I didn't realize it was a 120-second cooldown, which is a really long time, like 2 full minutes, and it's not that much weapon damage, and it only lasts for 10 seconds. So I think rather than that one, I moved that one over to clear casting. So now when you're initiating fights before you've taken damage, or if you're doing a good job like dodging stuff, you're always going to have 5% more damage up on your fire staff. And then I realized that mana is not an issue at all in this build because we're running reheat and because we only have one magic weapon that's actually using mana. Like the only way to go is just like holding your flamethrower for like a minute straight or longer. It takes forever to actually go And so I had a point in this flare talent at the bottom left of Fire Mage from other Fire Staff builds that I've done. That move's just really good, like making your heavy attack not cost mana. But I think we don't really need that because we're pretty much always close to full mana. And so I actually moved that up to Singe. And so now you basically have one talent point in your heavy attacks with this Fiery Restoration that's going to reduce your Fire Staff cooldowns by 10% when you hit a heavy. But then you also have this Singe on your light attacks. And so you can actually, if you have time to weave in a quick light attack, that's going to give you another burn stack on top of all the burn stacks that we already have. So this is kind of like the last thing in the fire tree that's going to give you one more extra burn. And I figured that might be pretty cool to start trying to weave in. And I didn't really do that in a lot of these clips early on because I wasn't running it. I was just focusing on heavy attacks. But I do think this Singed with the light attack could be pretty clutch, actually, just to weave in a couple more burn stacks when you have that quick chance for a light attack. So talking about the light attack and the heavy attack with the fire staff, just like most weapons, you can get a nice little animation cancel at the end of each of those if you go right into an ability or if you go right into a dodge. And so I think there are little windows that I wasn't really taking advantage of where if you have a quick second to get a quick light attack in before you start your flamethrower, you can light attack, animation cancel that light attack into flamethrower. And since flamethrower is always up, you can always use flamethrower as that little animation cancel. All right, so now getting into the actual build progression itself. So this is how we're going to build the fire staff going from level 1 to 20. I think the very first thing you want to do is fully upgrade flamethrower. Like even before grabbing your other abilities, it's kind of your main damage pump in this build, and the upgrades just make it completely insane. So the first one giving you 50% increased range, the second one increasing the base damage by 25%, and the third one completely removing the cooldown, which is kind of essential for how we're playing with the flamethrower. So we're going to hit that with the first 4 points, and then fifth point, we're going to jump up to Incinerate. And this is, the big slow cast, huge damage ability. Before we go ahead and upgrade that, though, we're going to jump over to Fire Mage and get our Fireball. And so first point in Fire Mage is in this Fiery Restoration, and that's going to give you 10% cooldown reduction every time you hit a heavy, which we just talked about a little bit ago. And then Clear Mind, so now anytime you're above 50% mana, you're going to gain 5% in power, so 5% damage buff. And because of what we just talked about mana with the Fire Staff, especially because we're running Reheat, we're pretty much always above 50% mana. The only time you're not going to be is if you're literally just holding Flamethrower for like a long time. So we're pretty much always going to have this 5% in power up. So 8th point, we're going to get to Fireball. And so now with Fire Staff level 9, you're going to have your 3 abilities, but Flamethrower is going to be the only one that's upgraded. And so from there, there's a couple really good Fire Staff passives that work with damage and burning that I think are kind of essential to pick up even before we upgrade Incinerate. So the first one's going to be this Spell Slinger over on Fire Mage. So that'll be your 9th point. And that's going to make it so all your Fire Staff abilities just have extra 10% chance to crit. Like absolutely beautiful talent. And then we're going to jump back over to Pyromancer and grab this Watch It Burn passive. So these two stack really nicely together where this is going to make it so every time you crit, it's going to inflict a burning stack doing 6% weapon damage each second for 6 seconds. So every crit is actually delivering a 36% weapon damage burn. And it'll stack up to 5 times. So critting with the Fire Staff, super valuable. And then the next one we're grabbing also really stacks very nicely with these two, which is back on the other side, Prophet of a Fire God. And this is going to make it so when you're holding a Fire Staff, your critical strike damage is increased by 15%. So You're getting 10% extra crit chance. You're burning for 36% weapon damage off of all those crits, and that stacks. And then your crits are actually hitting for 15% more. And so those are like some super high value passives that I think are worth grabbing kind of in this middle tier of the Fire Staff. And then last passive before we upgrade Incinerate is going to be Kindle. That's going to make your burning last 20% longer. And I think when we get to the armor and perks, we'll talk about this, but I think if you were able to get burning perk on like your ring, that could be a really good complement to this build because you have so many burns. Like you're literally accessing almost all the burns in the Fire Staff tree. You have your flamethrower burn that goes up to 5 stacks. You have that crit burn we just talked about that goes up to 5 stacks. You have your double stack of incinerate burn if you hit, and now you have singe, so your light attacks. We have your fireball burn on the ground, and now you have singe where your light attacks can stack up to 5 burns, which is that same 6% weapon damage over 6 seconds, which is, you know, basically 36% weapon damage over those 6 seconds. So that also stacks up to 5 times. So I think this Kindle making all those burns basically tick for another second or two is really strong, and especially if you paired that with that perk on like a ring, your burns are just going to tick for a really long time, like when you pull out your hammer to do stuff. All right, so from there, we're going to finish upgrading Incinerate. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the upgrades to Incinerate are also pretty insane. So the first one, Scorched, is going to make it so your Incinerate causes an additional stack of burning. So now you're going to get 2 stacks of burning off of that Incinerate. Then the second one, Cauterized Wounds, is going to restore 20% of the Incinerate damage as health, so a really nice self-heal. And then the last one is going to make it hit twice. And so this is what really amps the damage and really amps that heal you get from the damage because you're actually connecting 2 Incinerates and healing from both. So with this 15th point, once you're at Fire Staff level 16, you're really going to be in a good spot to be nuking stuff. But I think up to this point, you might be struggling with mana a little bit. And so if you wanted to, like we talked about at the very beginning of this Fire Staff progression, you could grab Flare on the way up and then take it out later on to make it so your heavy attacks don't cost mana. And then there's also another one at the top of Fire Mage that's spell focused that's going to make it so your heavy attacks restore 5% of your mana on hit. So if you get both those together, you can basically like regen mana with your heavies. And so I think as you're leveling, if mana is an issue for you, I think grabbing those 2 on the way up, and then once you get your 16th point, so Fire Staff level 17, you're going to be able to get Reheat. And then from there, mana is not going to be an issue pretty much at all. You have a very reliable way to get an insane amount of mana regen. And it's to the point where I never even was rocking mana pots in this build because I was just not even getting close to going pretty much all the time over 50% mana to get that 5% in power from Clear Mind as well. So next one is going to be Singed, which is going to give that burning stack on your light attacks. And then after that, we're going to grab Let It Burn over on Pyromancer. So this is going to make it so anytime any of your burns deal damage, you're going to get a 10% fortify for 2 seconds. And so you're burning, you have so many burns and you're burning stuff so much that you're pretty much always going to have this 10% fortify on, which is just another really good thing to kind of bolster your like heavy armor and your con perks that we're going to talk about in a bit. And then very final one, just for another nice little damage boost, going back to Fire Mage and grabbing Clear Casting. So this one's going to make it so if nothing's hit you in the last 3 seconds, so when you're initiating a fight or if you're just doing a really good job at dodging, you're going to be dealing 5% more damage that whole time. And so this kind of completes the Fire Staff build. It's very much focused on burns and setting up all of these abilities and burns with the Warhammer to essentially guarantee them. And then we're grabbing the Reheat Keystone to make mana a non-issue, so we don't have to take any other talent points on mana. And since we don't have a magic weapon in our other slot that's consuming mana, we're pretty much never going to run out. All right, so now taking a look at the Warhammer. A couple quick Warhammer tips. Just like the Fire Staff and most weapons in the game, you can get a nice little animation cancel at the end of your light or heavy attacks by using an ability or by using dodging. And so a lot of times I will heavy attack, and right after that heavy attack, I'll go into Wrecking Ball, or right after the heavy attack, I'll go into Shockwave, or right after the heavy attack, I'll go into Path of Destiny. So a lot of times you'll see me, like, if I'm starting a fight with a heavy attack, right after that, I'll go into a wrecking ball or a shockwave, and you can get those two together really fast, where you get the heavy and then you almost instantly get out the wrecking ball or start the shockwave animation, and it cancels the end of that heavy animation where you're like kind of pulling the hammer back. The other thing to keep in mind with melee weapons is if you are able to get behind your target somehow with a quick dodge, or they're in an ability animation or something like that, you're going to get a backstab guaranteed critical hit. So you'll see in a lot of these clips, I'm kind of dodging to the side and trying to get a little repositioned and maybe get a backstab with a hammer. And you can like do a heavy backstab right into a wrecking ball or shockwave like we just talked about. And a lot of times they'll still have their back turned to you. At that point, so you can go into like more hammer swings if you want, or pull out the fire stab and start torching them like we were talking about. The other insane thing about the hammer that we talked about earlier is how good it is at breaking stamina damage. And that's only really relevant on the heavy attack. I pretty much never light attack with the hammer. Number one, because it doesn't do nearly as much stamina damage, and number two, because we're not running any talents to benefit the light attack, and it doesn't do that much damage anyways. And so I think if you have a second to swing with the hammer, like fully charged heavies are pretty much the way to go. And we're going to start off the Warhammer progression grabbing the very first talent in Juggernaut, which is Hammer Time. And that's going to make it so every time you heavy attack, you're going to get a 20% damage buff for 4 seconds. So heavy attacks have even more value now, because if you heavy attack and go right into a Wrecking Ball, or you heavy attack and animation cancel go right into a Shockwave or even a Path of Destiny, all those abilities are going to be benefiting from this 20% in power. And then along that same thought train, the second one we're grabbing is right below that, Hardened Steel. And this is going to add grit to Warhammer heavy attacks. And it's also going to give you 12% damage reduction while that grit is active, like essentially while you're charging the heavy. So because this is not a strength build, because we don't have that 300 strength perk to give us grit on light and heavies, this is so clutch for this int build. And this makes it so you can very reliably trade hammer heavies, especially against like a mob with a shield, where if you're trying to break the shield, you can just charge heavies over and over until they raise their shield and you just shatter it, and then you can go right into the fire staff stuff. And while you're charging those heavies, you don't have to worry about getting staggered or knocked back or anything like that, because grit is active. So third, we're grabbing our first ability, which is Wrecking Ball. So this is the one that puts them on the ground. This ability also has grit, which is very nice. So if you heavy attack and you animation cancel the end of that into an instant Wrecking Ball, that whole chain is going to have grit. And so feels really good. Mobs can't like stagger you out of that chain. And once you get them on the ground with the Wrecking Ball, you know, you can switch to the fire staff and do all that stuff, but that sort of heavy attack into Wrecking Ball to get them on the ground can't be stopped unless you're stunned. So fourth, we're jumping over to Crowd Crusher to make our way to the other two abilities. So we're starting with Outnumbered at the top left. That's going to give you 10% damage reduction if 2 or more enemies are close to you. And then fifth, we're grabbing Shockwave. So this is your huge AoE stun. I think probably the best Warhammer ability, one of the best abilities in the game, honestly, because it's just a massive stun, and this ability has grit. So your heavy attacks have grit, your Wrecking Ball has grit, and your Shockwave has grit. So when you have your hammer out and you're doing this stuff, you're uninterruptible. And against a lot of NPCs that have a lot of like knockback and stagger mechanics, it just makes it really nice, like going into the melee in a non-strength build, being able to like rip all this stuff out without getting staggered. And then sixth, we're grabbing Path of Destiny. And so this is the only thing that doesn't have grit for the Warhammer in this build, pretty much, that we're going to be using. And so that's why I try to use Path of Destiny when I have a little more space. And you'll see in a lot of these clips, like my other Warhammer abilities pretty much never get interrupted. Path of Destiny, I get staggered out of quite a bit when I'm trying to do it. And so that kind of gives you some reference into how useful this grit actually is for these other abilities. But Path of Destiny, we talked about it, just really good. Long range kind of AoE stagger slow, especially once we get the Keystone Aftershock in Crowd Crusher. So next we're going to grab this passive right under it, Prevailing Spirit. And so this is going to make it so we heal for 35% of the damage dealt when using a Crowd Crusher ability. So anytime you hit a Shockwave stun, or anytime you hit a Path of Destiny, you are going to be healing for 35% of that damage dealt. And then there's actually another Warhammer perk that you can grab for Path of Destiny that's going to give you even more healing off of that, if that's something you want to build. And then eighth, we're going to grab the Stagger for Path of Destiny, because that's what makes it really good. So the first upgrade to Path of Destiny, Seismic Waves, is going to make it so now everything you connect it with is going to get staggered back for a second. And that really helps you, get some space and buy some time to go into your next combo or like whip out the fire staff and just keep torching stuff. And then from there, before we grab the last upgrade of Shockwave, which I think is a little less useful, we're going to go over to Shockwave and grab these 2 upgrades. So first one is Frailty. This is going to make it so every time you land this stun, those mobs are going to have a 10% weaken on them for 10 seconds. So anything hit by this is going to be doing 10% less damage to you for the next 10 seconds. And then the last one is going to increase the range of Shockwave from 3 meters to 4 meters. And so just going to give you an even bigger kind of AoE stun. And once you get this upgrade for 4 meters, this is almost the exact radius of Incinerate. And so, you know, anything that gets stunned within your Shockwave is pretty much, you know, almost always going to get hit by your Incinerate if you're standing in the same exact place going into that Incinerate. So then 11th, we're going to jump back over to Crowd Crusher and grab Concussive Impact. And so this is going to make it so you deal 15% increased damage against targets affected by Warhammer debuffs. And this is going to really come into play once you get Aftershock, the Keystone, because that's going to make it so all of your crowd control effects apply a slow. But if something's stunned by Shockwave, you're going to benefit from this 15% extra damage from the hammer. And then if something is staggered by Path of Destiny, you will. And when Aftershock is on them, once we get that upgrade, anything with Aftershock, you're going to be doing 15% damage too with the Warhammer as well. And then 12th, we're jumping back over to Wrecking Ball, grabbing the 2 upgrades. So first one is Safety Measures. This is going to make it so when you use your Wrecking Ball and put stuff on the ground, you're going to get a Fortify, which is 20% damage reduction for 7 seconds. So very useful for just mitigating more damage in this like heavy armor, like Magic Bruiser build. And then right after that, we're grabbing Breathing Room. And this is going to expand the range of Wrecking Ball to 1.5 meters. I'm not sure what the original range is, but it feels a lot better with this upgrade. Once you get this upgrade, you'll see that you can kind of hit like even little off to the side of stuff, and it'll still put them on the ground. So it just kind of makes it like more reliable to connect. And then next we're moving back over to Crowd Crusher and grabbing this Facilitated Expedition. And so now anytime we hit a target with an active debuff, and this doesn't specify Warhammer debuff, this is any debuff. So if you hit anything with a burn on it, or any of these Warhammer debuffs we just talked about, you're going to get haste, increasing your movement speed by 15% for 3 seconds. So this is just useful to kind of, after you use your Warhammer stuff, to, you know, get that space or position yourself accordingly to use whatever you're going to go into with your fire staff. And then 15th, kind of because we have to, I think it's decent, but it's not the best, is getting this stimulated reduction at the end of Path of Destiny. And so, you know, the main thing this is going to do is if you hit like a big group of mobs, it's maxed out at 5 mobs. But if you hit 5 mobs, that's going to reduce the cooldown of Path of Destiny itself by 25%. So because we're not using Path of Destiny as like a huge part of our combo, it's more of like a fill move that we use to keep space and in between our combos. This is useful, but it's not crazy. But we mainly need to get it because we have to get one in this lower row to get to Aftershock. So Aftershock is the keystone on the Crowd Crusher side. So this is essentially going to make it so that all of your Warhammer abilities trigger this Aftershock. So you have CC on your Wrecking Ball because it knocks them down. You have CC on your Shockwave because it stuns them. You have CC on your Path of Destiny because it staggers them. And so all of those moves are going to trigger this debuff, which is going to kick in your concussive impact like we talked about, and is also going to slow them by 20% for 4 seconds, which is really good to kind of buy us a little more space and time to switch to the Fire Staff and go into our Fire Staff combos or just strafe backward as we keep torching them. 17th point, we're jumping back to Juggernaut, grabbing this Power Through Pain. This is going to make it so for 1 second after you take damage, you're dealing 35% extra damage. So this one's really nice because it just makes it so as you're charging like that heavy into Wrecking Ball or the heavy into Shockwave, if you get hit at all during that window, like when you land that heavy or when you land that Wrecking Ball, it's just going to have 35% extra damage on it. So it really brings your Warhammer damage up a bit, especially, you know, not being strength, like running an int gem. It makes those abilities, and even the heavy, if you get hit, like while you're, you know, grit charging that heavy, if you get hit, that heavy is going to slap 35% harder than it otherwise would. And then 18th, we're jumping back over to grab this last Crowd Crusher passive, which is Guarded Sprint. And so this is going to make it so just anytime you have your Warhammer out and you're holding it, running around, you're going to take 10% less damage because sprinting is just how you naturally move in the game. And so This is just a solid one for a little extra damage reduction when you're in the shit trying to do stuff with your Warhammer. And then very last one, we're jumping back over to Juggernaut and we're grabbing Quick Recovery. And this is going to make it so our heavy attacks that hit reduce the cooldowns of all of our Warhammer abilities by 7%. And so just another passive talent leaning into those heavy attacks that we're focused on. I'm going to give you just a little extra CDR for your CC abilities with the Warhammer to be able to set up the Fire Staff more often. So this is the final Warhammer build. Like we talked about, very focused on control, CC, and slowing and beefing you up so you can go in there, have the grit, trade, with this Warhammer setup, and then switch to the Fire Staff and rip your huge damage and your combos off of all this setup we got here. All right, so final big section here, we're going to be talking about attributes, armor, and perks. And so starting off with attributes, this is an int build at its core, but because we are rocking heavy, we're going to be leaning quite a bit into con as well. And I think if you're going for any sort of melee damage build, and you're trying to run heavy to where you're beefy and can take hits and trades, scaling up to the 200 con perk can be very useful because that perk is going to increase your armor, both physical and elemental, by 10%. And so because heavy armor has the most armor on it, that's going to be the biggest 10% you can get versus medium or light, if that makes sense. And then the 100 con perk as well is going to increase your max health by 10% of your physical armor. And so these two perks stack very nicely together. We're going to be getting that 10% increase to physical armor, and then you're getting 10% of your max health based off that number. And then the 150 con perk is just flat out really good for PvP and PvE. That's basically just flat 10% resilience, going to give you 10% critical damage reduction. And then the 50 con perk you're going to get along the way, but this is just going to make your health pots and your regen pots 20% stronger, which is always good. So I think kind of the ratio you want to be looking at as you level up is maybe like 3 to 1 or 3 to 2 con. So like for every 3 intelligence you get, maybe grab 1 or 2 con. And I think leveling up, you have a bit more flexibility in how you want to play this with the armor. Honestly, I think any build can work with any type of armor, like any weight. But I think certain, builds favor certain weights based on how you're trying to play them. And so for this build, like especially at 60, because we're trading a lot in the melee, heavy armor really felt super strong and kind of invincible in a crazy way, especially because I haven't rocked heavy armor in a bit. It feels really strong in this game state right now. But like I said, when you're leveling, especially if you're focused on, dodging and reacting and not taking damage, I think if you wanted to go faster, you could rock a light set so you get that longer roll for moving across the world. Then you're going to have higher damage output on all your abilities and stuff. You just got to be careful taking those trades in melee, but leveling up stuff is a lot less punishing, than some of these like bigger mobs in Sandlands. But in general, I think heavy armor is the way to go. Now, taking a look at the int perks we're going to be getting along the way, all pretty high value for this build, actually. Some more than others, but all of them add something. And so at 50, we're going to be at 10% increased damage to backstabs and random critical hits. So that's going to be backstabs you get with your hammer, or any random crit you're going to be getting with the fire staff or the hammer is going to be getting that 10% damage increase. Then at 10%, just your light and heavy magic attacks are going to get a 10% boost. This is probably one of the less valuable ones because we're not doing a ton of that. But with the change I talked about, getting singed and trying to weave in those light attacks for that extra burn, this would benefit that for sure. Then this 150 in perk is kind of nuts, just flat 15% increase to elemental damage. So this is going to increase everything you do with the fire staff by 15%. But on top of that, it's going to make the 50% of your hammer that's fire get this 15% increase as well. So you actually have a 15% LE damage increase on the half of your hammer that is magic. So that's going to really help a little bit of that lacking damage from only having the hammer scale halfway from the int gem versus like a full strength hammer. 200 imp perk, also kind of nuts. You're going to be getting 10 mana after a dodge. So this combined with reheat, you're literally never going to go pretty much only time you'll go is if you sit there and hold the flamethrower for like a minute. But other than that, your mana is going to be good to the point where you don't even have to worry about rocking mana pots in one of your consume slots. And so you can use those slots for a more effective tool. And so I think the three things you always want to run is health pot, food, and a regen pot. And these are kind of the 3 ways to recover health, where if you're not getting hit, you can eat food and regen, and that regen will go until you get hit again. If you are getting hit and you need that instant heal, you rip your healing pot. And right after that, on a separate cooldown, if you need more health in that window, you can pop your regen pot. So you get your instant heal from your healing pot. If you're not getting hit, you want to regen with food. If you are getting hit, you want to regen over time with that regen pot. And one of the perks we're going to talk about in a bit is this purifying toast on the earrings. And this is a perk that I kind of can't live without at this point. I think the value you can get out of it if you use it right is completely insane, where it's going to make your regen pot remove a debuff. So not only are you going to get this health regen over time and mana regen over time, by the way, you're also going to get a cleanse, a debuff cleanse from your regen pot. So you can use it for the health if you need it, or you can use it to cleanse a critical debuff, a root, a burn, slow, anything like that. You can instantly cleanse it with this earring perk, Purifying Toast, by ripping a regen pot. And then the 250 perk is going to be a 30% duration to damage over time spells. I haven't fully tested this one, so I'm not 100% sure what is considered damage over time, but in my head, a burn has to be a damage over time. And so at the very minimum, this should make all of your burns tick 30% longer. That's going to stack with that Kindle passive we got in the Fire Staff that gives you 20% burn duration. And then if you grab a ring perk that gives you the burn duration as well, you can get up to 30% from this, 30% from the ring, 20% from the talents. So like 80% increase burn duration if you end up getting that perk in your ring. So I also think this should give the ground burn on Fireball extra 30% duration as well. So I haven't actually like tested and confirmed that, but when you read this perk, what else could be damage over time, right? It's got to be burns and stuff like that. So, and then the 300 imp perk is decent, but not quite as good in my opinion as some of the other 300 perks. And so this is going to give you 10% damage on your first hit on a full health target. So I don't really play into this one, but you could if you wanted, where you get a good Fireball open, or one of your big abilities for that 10% open. A lot of times I'll just open with a Fire Staff auto attack if they're far away, or a hammer heavy leading into like a Wrecking Ball to put them on the ground. And so those will benefit from this, but if you wanted to use an ability at the beginning to benefit from this 10%, you could definitely do that as well. So that's the split that I think is really solid for this build. I think if you were trying to rock medium or light, it would probably be worth playing into that play style and pulling some con out and putting more into int. So if I was playing medium, I would probably go to like 150 con, like 100 or 150 con would be good checkpoints if I was playing medium, and then stop there. If I was playing light, I'd probably just go like as little con as I could get. Like if you're going to go light, I think the play is just go full glass cannon, and you could put a little bit in there, like get to 50, just to give you that little bit of cushion in case you fuck up and get hit. But, I think if you're going for that glass cannon light build, you might as well just go all the way and go for like a, at the very max range, like 500 int 0 con build at level 60 with like full attributes. But especially at 60, because we have a melee weapon and because we're trading a lot and because mobs can slap pretty hard, especially in Brimstone, I really think the heavy armor with the 200 con to really benefit from those perks, and then dumping the rest into int, still being able to get 300 or more int. So you still have really good damage, and to me it feels like kind of the perfect mix of survivability, durability, and damage output. All right, final thing we're going to take a look at are the item perks we are able to get on our gear, on our weapons, on our armor, and on our jewelry. So I'm going to start with the 3 weapon perks that correlate to each ability for the 3 weapons, because I think for this build, some of these perks are actually pretty damn solid. And I wasn't running any of these, by the way. I just have a very kind of overall decent heavy gear set. You'll see a couple Void Bent pieces. I got these 3 Conqueror pieces as well. So I have Conqueror helm, chest, and legs. And then I have Void Bent gloves and boots. And so a heavy set like this just has like good overall perks for running like any build. But I think if you were going to all in this build, it would be probably worth trying to grab a couple of these perks along the way if you're trying to buy new gear and like gear up for it. And then the other thing is I think these perks get a lot more valuable when you're at max level and your stuff's at 600 or even 625, because the perk scales with that gear progression. And so if you're leveling up, you know, snagging some of this stuff because you get lucky and find a piece that has it is always good, and it will help you, but the numbers aren't going to be nearly as good as they will once you get that perk on a piece of gear that's fully scaled up to 600 or even 625. And the other thing that I just noticed that I don't know if it's always been there, if it's a new thing, but if any of these perks are actually on the weapon itself instead of on armor, they're a little bit better. And so you can see by these tooltips, you know, if you get these perks on the fire staff, they're going to have a little more benefit than if you just get them on an armor piece. So I'm going to just reference the armor ones to make it easy. And I'll kind of give you both ends of the scale so you can see where it starts and where it ends. But starting with the fire staff and taking a look at kind of our main ability with the fire staff is this accelerating flamethrower perk. This is going to make it so applying 3 stacks of your burn damage, which comes out hella fast, by the way. That's a second and a half because you're hitting every half second with flamethrower. So if you torch something for a second and a half, you're going to get a 20% movement speed for 2 seconds. And your movement is slowed, you know, when you're in the flamethrower animation. And so this kind of will help you kite a little bit, especially when you're like kiting backward, you know, just torching stuff in one of the middle parts of your combos. And then it's also going to make the burn from the flamethrower last 15% longer. And that's going to stack really nicely with those burn duration things we talked about earlier. So the cool thing about this one is at the lowest level, like the lowest scaled version, you're still going to get the same movement speed. So even at the lowest scaled piece of gear, you can get this, like leveling up, you're still going to get that 20% haste for 2 seconds. But the burn scales down, so the burn lasts 10% longer, which is honestly really good for a 100 item level perk. So this perk actually is really good at a base level and scales up a little bit, but this is kind of just like a solid one for any time through the build. Next one we're going to take a look at is Empowering Fireball. And so this is just going to make it so the impact of your fireball does more damage. So not too crazy, but definitely will help your DPS if you're able to snag it. Extra damage never can hurt. This one actually has a fat difference between the perk being on the weapon and the perk being on the gear. So if you get this perk on your gear at max level, you're going to get 32% additional damage. If you get it on your staff, you're going to get 58% additional damage. So pretty fucking close to double if you actually get the perk on the staff, which is very interesting to me, actually. Definitely a bigger scaling difference than the one we just looked at, Accelerating Flamethrower, where the only difference between getting it on your armor or your staff is a 4% burn duration. And then at the lowest level, if you get this on your gear, Fireball is going to do 5% additional damage. But again, if you're able to find a fire staff with it as you're leveling up, it's actually going to be 31% additional damage at the lowest scaling at 100 gear score. So this one's kind of nuts if you get it on the staff. I think if you find it on gear, it won't hurt. But I think if you're going for this, potentially looking at a fire staff that has this on it could be a good call. And then last one for the fire staff is Stable Incinerate. And I think this one would be higher value if you didn't have the Warhammer. But because we're trying to stun stuff with the hammer, before we go into Incinerate to guarantee it, the grit isn't quite as crucial. And so if you're doing that stun combo into Incinerate, you're not going to really benefit from this grit because everything's just stunned anyways. But it does deal 12% additional damage if it's on your armor at max level, 20% additional damage if it's on your staff, so 8% jump going from armor to staff. And the grit definitely could be useful if you find yourself using Incinerate without the Shockwave stun, which, you know, I do sometimes just based on the situation. If you can get a good dodge into an Incinerate when, you know, maybe your Shockwave is on cooldown or something for the heal or for the knockback or for the burn. Definitely some situations where I use it without Shockwave, but I think this is probably the lowest value of the 3 Fire Staff perks. And then if you get it at the lowest level at 100 gear score, it's going to give 3% additional damage on the armor, 11% additional on the staff. All right, so now taking a look at the 3 perks for the Warhammer abilities. First one is Penetrating Wrecking Ball. So this is going to make it so Wrecking Ball penetrates some percentage of the target's armor. And all that's really going to do is make your Wrecking Ball do a little more damage. And so because we're not really using Wrecking Ball for the damage, we're using it for, you know, the setup for the Fire Staff. This one is decent, but you could definitely go without it. So it's 19% on the gear at max level, 33% if you actually get it on your Warhammer at max level. and then going all the way down to the 100 gear score at the beginning, you're going to get 5% from it on armor, and you're going to get 19% of it if you have it on the hammer. So that one, if you happen to get it, good, but I don't think it's necessarily worth going after. Next one is Sundering Shockwave, and this is going to make it so your Shockwave inflicts rend, which basically makes the target take more damage from all sources, actually. And so this one's actually really solid because it lasts 10 seconds. So anytime you Shockwave, all that sort of fire staff burst you do afterward, the incinerate into the torching or fireball or whatever, is going to benefit from this rend. And so I think this one's actually pretty damn solid. So at max level, you're going to get 9.8% rend if you have it on armor, 14% rend if you have it on your Warhammer, and then at the lowest level, you're going to get 5% rend if it's on your armor, 9.6% if you find it on the hammer. All right, so last one is going to be this Leeching Path of Destiny, and this one's like kind of really clutch for the way we're using Path of Destiny in this build, and the way we're already getting healing off of it from that passive in the Warhammer tree. Prevailing Spirit, that's going to give you that 35% heal off of damage done when using a Crowd Crusher ability. And so the stack with these two is going to be really good, especially if you end up getting some life stealing on your Warhammer, on your ring, or with any of those casings we talked about. Because all that's going to stack. So at max level, if you find this on your gear, it's going to heal you for 29% of the damage done. So if you have that stacked with Prevailing Spirit, that's going to be 64% heal off of Path of Destiny without any extra leeching. And then if you find it on your hammer, it's actually going to be 47% heal off the damage done. And if you add the 35% from the talent passive to that, that's going to be, 82% of the damage you deal healed for Path of Destiny without any leeching. So you can really make Path of Destiny a really great self-healing tool if you intentionally build into this perk, I think. And then at the lowest level, 100 gear score, it's going to give you 10% healing if it's on your armor and 28% healing if it's on your hammer. And so I think you're not going to really feel it that much if it's on your armor, but if it's on your hammer at a lower level, you probably will feel that heal quite a bit. All right, so those are the correlating weapon perks for the specific abilities we're using for each weapon. Besides those, there's kind of so many more perks that you can get your hands on that could be good for different situations. So I'm going to talk about what I think would be sort of the best or most synergistic with trying to play a heavy magic, basically battle mage style that we're going for. And so on that line of thought, because we're trading a lot in melee and we are taking damage a good chunk of the time, I really love leeching as a perk. And at max scaling, that's going to give you 5.2% extra life stealing from all of your damage done from everything. So your autos, your abilities with both the Fire Staff and the Warhammer. The only places you can actually get leeching rolls are your ring and on the weapon itself. And then at max level, these gem casings we talked about. And I actually invested in a Fire Staff and some jewelry after this to try to lean into this style, but I haven't had a huge chance to test it or do anything else yet because I'm really trying to get this video out. And so I think this is going to end up really benefiting, if you were using this build in PvP. I think leeching is one of the best perks you can kind of stack for PvP, especially if you're in heavy, because not only are you really hard to kill, you're also vamping a ton from all of the damage you're dishing out. So you can get 5.2% leeching on your ring. You can get 5.2% leeching on either of your weapons, on your Fire Staff or your Warhammer. I don't think you really need it on your Warhammer. You could get it and it would stack really well with those Warhammer perks and the Warhammer passive that heals off the Crowd Crusher stuff, but because a huge chunk of your damage is coming from your Fire Staff, I think that's going to be the highest value weapon to get leeching on. And then you can add an additional 3% to that if you want with one of these gem casings on your weapon. And then if you do a gem casing for each of the gems you put in your armor, this leeching case, you can get 1% for each armor slot as well. You can't use these casings in jewelry, it seems. So you get the 5% from the ring, the 5% from the weapon, the 3% from the casing gem on the weapon, and the 5% from the 5 casings on your armor. So max leeching stack you can get to is about 18.4%, which is an insane amount of leeching, and I do not have the cash to do that leeching casing thing yet, but it's definitely something that I'm going to be looking at doing for my heavy concept that I use for a bunch of different builds. And then along this same line of thought of being unkillable, I think getting regeneration on your earrings really complements the leeching vamp stuff really well, because not only do you get, you know, massive damage reduction from your heavy armor and those con perks, you're getting the leeching off of all the damage you do, and then in between all that, you're just getting a 0.5% of your health regen every second from the regeneration perk on your earrings. And of these perks, the regeneration one was actually the only one I was running in most of these clips. So most of the healing you see in all these clips I did is from the regeneration on my earrings and the natural self-healing built into the Fire Staff and Warhammer abilities. But I did actually end up investing in a ring and a Fire Staff with leeching, and I dropped some cash on a leeching casing to put in that Fire Staff. And so when you look at the bottom right at my Fire Staff, I had my old Fire Staff, which is this one, with Keen Vicious Refreshing Move on it, which was kind of BIS before these attunement perks came out that add damage. But I really wanted to get one with lifestealing and try this lifestealing button. So if you look in the bottom right, you can tell if I'm running the leeching build or not in any of these clips, because it'll show the green looking Fire Staff with the gem casing on it, or it'll just show my normal one with just the regular opal. So you got the leeching stack, you got the regen on the earrings. The other thing that I think is so clutch on earrings for literally any build is Purifying Toast. And I talked about it a little bit earlier, but that's going to make it so anytime you pop a regen pot, you're going to get a cleanse from a debuff that's on you. And so not only can you use the regen pot for the gradual health reduction as you're in combat, you can also use it as a cleanse. And this is just so OP. I literally don't do a build without this one. I'll probably end up talking about it in every build guide I do, because I really do think it's that good of a perk. And then the main one you want to grab on your necklace is health, and that's going to kind of complete this like trying to become an invincible vamp battle mage idea, where you have the 10% extra health on the neck, then you have the leeching stack on the ring, then you have the regen and the purifying toast on the earrings. Just going to really kind of give you some extra healing regen and utility to sustain really long time over really hard fights. And then the last one related to jewelry that I think is really good to try to grab is Hardy on the ring. And especially in heavy armor, Hardy is like one of the best ring perks you can get. And the reason that is because it gives you 3 full dodges in one stamina bar versus 2. And so in heavy armor or in light armor, if you dodge, it costs 50 stamina. So your stamina bar is at 100. If you dodge twice in a row, you're stammed out. You're going gray, you're going to be slow, exhausted, and it's going to have to regen all the way back up. But if you have Hardy in your ring, if you dodge twice in a row, because you have that 10 extra stamina, you have 110 total. If you dodge twice in a row, you're going to be at 10 stamina. And so getting Hardy in your ring in heavy or light actually gives you the ability to do 2 dodges back to back without getting stammed out, without getting exhausted. And I think that just opens up a lot more options to give you more ability to dodge more often. And, you know, if you don't time it right, you can't double dodge to try to avoid something without stamping yourself out. And then as far as like overall perks on weapons, I think Keen and Vicious are really good. I think for the Warhammer, because we're not really using it on damage, if you could scoop one of those really good Warhammer perks, whichever one you're feeling on your Warhammer, that gets a big bonus, I think that could be really good. You know, and then on Void Vent, you got luck. So if you're going for named items, that's decent. I don't think luck is valuable at all really for leveling up, because there's not that many useful named items as you level. It's more of like a level cap thing where you're going to be looking at stacking luck. Refreshing, any of the refreshing perks, refreshing flat out is really solid. Refreshing evasion is really solid, especially with the extra dodging we can do with Hardy. I think a really good option for gear for this build is if you're able to grab any of the Conqueror's pieces from Tempest. So these are just name drops from Tempest that'll drop at 590 or higher if you have your expertise that high. And they're just really good, heavy con, triple perk stack items that are good for both PvP and PvE, very well-rounded. And the cool thing about building a heavy concept with just kind of overall good perks is you can use it for literally any build you're trying to do out of heavy armor that has some con. You can use that same gear. So if you upgrade a heavy concept like Conquerors to 625, you have a ton of build options you can use out of that heavy concept versus, you know, kind of bottlenecking yourself into dex or into strength or one of the other attributes. I'm sure I'm missing at least like 18 other ones that would be pretty damn good for this build, but last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up are the gems and the potential casings you can put on the gems now. So for your armor, I think going with any of the ones that have any of the damage reduction are good. I think in general, there's more physical damage in the game than magic damage, but there definitely is some magic damage from some mobs, and so I think Diamond is a really safe bet where you get that physical leaning reduction, but still a little bit of elemental. Onyx is really good as well, just going full physical. Malachite's good if you want to lean a little more elemental, and if you want to go full elemental, Opal's a good choice as well. And so kind of however you're looking to supplement your resistances, you can use any of those 4 to get any kind of mix of physical reduction versus LE reduction. And then for the casings for your armor, you can get the leeching ones we talked about, where if you put a leeching case, like let's say you have an onyx and you put a leeching case on it, it's going to drop the value of that onyx a little bit, so it'll take it from 2.5% physical damage reduction to 2% physical damage reduction, but you're going to get 1% leeching off of all your damage done benefit from that casing. So the casings basically scale the gem down a tiny bit, but give you an added benefit. So I think leeching would be really good with this build. I think if you're going for max damage, one that could be really cool is that ignited casing, where you're actually going to be getting an extra 1% fire damage that you can build into each of your armor pieces. So if you put an ignited casing on your 5 gems in your armor, that's going to give you 5% bonus fire damage, which pretty damn sick for this fire build. And then looking at gems for weapons, for your Warhammer, you have to go with an LE gem for this build. There's no other option. I think just going all in on fire, both thematically and for certain things you can do with the build, like for instance, those gem casings we were talking about. I think if you were to find a Abyss ring with a 3rd perk, fire damage as a perk, which gives you like almost 5% extra fire damage on your ring, could be an insane, 3rd perk. So if your ring has leeching, hardy, and fire damage, I think that's like literal Abyss ring for a build like this. And if you put the ruby, the fire elemental gem, in your hammer is going to benefit from all this bonus fire damage as well, not just your fire staff. And so the scaling would work the same with other LE gems, but I think, if you're leading into the fire build, just going with a ruby and being a total fire badass is the way. And then for the fire staff, I think there's actually a couple options that could work pretty well. I think Opal or Diamond would be really solid. And you'll see I favor Opal, and here's the kind of difference between the two. If you're going for like an invincible leeching, like being able to solo really hard stuff and live build, the Opal is the way to go. If you're going for like a max DPS, like dungeon grind, or just like cleaving, stuff at max clip, especially if you're like leveling in light armor or something, I think Diamond is the way to go. So Diamond's going to give you that 15% increased damage when you're at full health. So if you're not getting hit and you're nuking stuff, you're always going to have that 15% damage stack up on pretty much everything you do at full health. Once you get to level cap and you get into Brimstone Sands, if you're looking to really push your limits and like solo content that's hard, the Opal becomes much more valuable, because if you're trying to get this leeching off of your damage, the Diamond is never going to benefit your leeching, because your Diamond only kicks in when you're at full health, and you don't need leeching if you're at full health, right? On top of that, like some of the mobs in Sandlands just kind of fuck, and so if you get hit, which happens a lot, and you're not at full health, if you have a Diamond, you're going to lose that 15% damage until you're able to heal up. But if you have an Opal, every time you're dodging in combat, you're going to be activating that 15% damage boost. And that 15% damage boost is going to feed into your life stealing. So because you're regenning from your damage done, that 15% damage you get from the Opal when you're dodging is going to boost your life stealing. And so for me, I think like leveling up or like dungeon grinding where you're not getting hit, Diamond's the call. If you're looking to solo really hard content at max level and kind of push the limits of this build, I really think Opal is the way to go. And then for casings, for these weapon gems, I think a really cool stack that I would want to try to do is doing the ignited one that adds the fire dot on my hammer. So encase the ruby in an ignited casing and put that in your Warhammer. So now anytime you hit with a Warhammer heavy or any of your abilities, including like a massive
Path of Destiny or Shockwave, everything you hit is going to be hit with that 2-second dot stack, which is actually going to tick for 3 instances of damage. So it's going to tick right when you hit them, and then you get 2 more ticks of dot damage. And with the ignited casing, it actually counts it as a burn. And so all of the increased burn duration that you're getting from the build that we talked about should actually feed into this burn dot that you're getting from the ignited casing on the ruby in the hammer. And I think you could do this same thing with the fire staff if you really wanted to max out on it, but the dot doesn't stack. And so I think putting ignited on both weapons is not the call. I think kind of the optimal call for the best version of this build at 60 would be ignited casing on the hammer ruby and then leeching on the fire staff opal. And if you have leeching already in your fire staff, that's going to jump your fire staff leeching to 8.2% extra healing off of damage done from your fire staff. So now you're getting the ignite dot burn from every time you connect a Warhammer ability, and then you're getting that mega life stealing from the max damage coming out of your fire staff. Boom. That is it. That is all she wrote on Firehammer. These always end up going so long and taking me way longer than I think they're going to, but this game's just so deep, and there's so much kind of customization. There's so many choices to make and things you can do with build paths that I really want to give, you know, like a fully in-depth explanation of my reasoning and my logic and why I'm doing sort of these things. Because I think if you understand something deeply, you have a much better chance at being able to successfully execute on it. And so I really hope this was useful. I really hope some people end up giving it a try and really enjoying it. Honestly, one of the most fun builds that I've just sort of randomly decided to do and like dropped into. Felt instantly comfortable on it. Felt exceptionally powerful, like way stronger than I thought it was going to feel at max level, you know, kind of sacrificing some base stats by having an int melee weapon. But turns out that the Warhammer just pairs so well with enabling the fire staff damage that you end up getting potentially more damage out than you would, you know, in like a fully stacked strength or dex build. Alrighty, that's all I got. I hope you are enjoying your time in Eternum. Take care of yourself, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.